The Feature
on BBC Radio Lancashire.
Now the feature. And tonight we hear the little-known story of how the North Lancashire village of Wray was almost washed away in a freak flash flood exactly 40 years ago. Liz Andrew has been to Wray to gather first-hand accounts from some of the people who literally feared for their lives on the evening the River Roeburn terrifyingly broke its banks.
I'm standing by the River Roeburn, just a few yards from the village of Wray. Today it's just a few inches deep, but one summer's evening 40 years ago it was transformed into a terrifying flood. Emmeline Garnett has written a book about the Wray Flood, and she helped me find the people who can remember the events of that night. Emmeline, how did it start?
There was a cloudburst up on the fells about 4 miles away on, 8th of August 1967 at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And the flood brought down a tremendous number of trees, and it was that which really did all the damage. It was first noticed, of course, up on the fells, but at Backsbottom Farm the damage really began. That's about a mile out of Wray, and Alice Brown's husband Bill and his friend Len were busy dipping the sheep.
They came in for a cup of tea, and it came on absolutely pouring down. And the water started coming over the garden. So Len said, "Come on, we'll have to get those sheep out, Bill." So they rushed out to the sheep pen. They got the sheep out, but the lambs were difficult. They were having to move them, and by that time the water was coming in very fast. And it started washing them out the other way, and they just got drowned. They just turned over and over, and they were washed away, the lambs.
Anne Jones had been at home all day looking after her grandmother who'd had a fall. They lived with Anne's father on the main street in the village. Their cottage backed onto the river.
It was quite sunny, and then around tea time it started to go dark, and my father came in from work, and I think it was around 5:30 in the afternoon, and he said to me, "You've left the kettle on." And I said, "I haven't. I mean, there weren't kettles like they are nowadays that knock themselves off." He said, "I can hear the water heating up." And I said, "I haven't had the kettle on." And we came in here and we looked out of the window here, and there was a wall of water, not very deep, a bit like a bore, a small bore. And there were ducks in front of it. And I still can't understand why they didn't get up and fly away. But they were pedalling like mad in front of this wall of water. So I went down into the cellar and out into the garden. And at that time, we had steps down to the river itself. And I stood at the top of the small steps that went to the river. And the water just came up. And as it reached my feet, I thought, I better move. And I came back in through the back door, and I locked the door.
Nearer the middle of the village at Hoskins Farm, Margaret Staveley noticed the unusual colour of the sky.
It was different because it was the sky. It wasn't raining. The sky had gone an awful colour. I've never seen it since that colour. It was a reddy grey, and then all of a sudden the drops started and it started to rain, and then this water just came from nowhere, really. We just had tea, and then my husband went out to feed the calves. Came back in, said, "I can't, the water's so deep, I need my wellies." So he puts his wellies on, goes out, and it was over the tops of his Wellingtons as well. It was really, really deep. And of course it burst the barn doors and took the hay and straw out onto the street. Someone rang the policeman and said, "Staveley's hay is blocking the bus's route. Can you come?" So, of course, our local policeman came and tried to help us put it back, but every time we tried to throw it to one side, it floated back again. So anyway, we let the bus through so that it could go through the village, and then went back to rescue our calves, out of the water. And they were well up, almost right up past the legs and halfway up the bodies. And so Jerry, our policeman, said to me, "Get the Land Rover out, Margaret, and take me to see what the river looks like. Must be a lot of water in it." So I took him to the Mealbank Bridge.
Emmeline, you brought me to Mealbank Bridge now. What are we looking at?
Well, we're looking over the bridge at the Hindburn River. The Roeburn joins the Hindburn just below the village, and now it's called the Hindburn. This is a new bridge, of course. The old bridge was swept away that day, and this is where Margaret brought Jerry, and they looked over and saw all sorts of things being swept down the river.
It was a sight that I could never believe, because the water was so high, it was bank deep, more than bank deep. But the thing that concerned me was that in the centre of the flood there were household articles coming down and bits of cars and wheels. But the main thing that concerned me was that there was a bathroom cabinet that nobody would have thrown away, and it was bobbing away merrily down the flood. And that gave me an impression that somebody was in trouble at the other end of the village.
Margaret knew something was wrong when she spotted a familiar chair.
Yes, there was lots of things coming down, furniture, but it was the chair that made me realise that it was out of a house. I hadn't a clue where it was coming from up to then. I said, that's Mrs. Johnson's chair out of her house. She'd not been married very long, hadn't Mrs. Johnson, and her husband had done this chair up for her. It's one of those Rexine chairs with, the brass tacks round, and it was just coming down the river. I couldn't believe it. I knew she wouldn't have thrown it out. So, of course, that's when Jerry said, right, get me to the other end.
So we're now back in the village at Smithy Brow.
Yes, I always think this is the most impressive place because it's a long way down to the river if you stand at Smithy Brow, and yet everybody who remembers the flood all say, and the water was coming over Smithy Brow. And it was.
When we got to the corner at Smithy Brow, the local people were all huddled together at the side of the road, gazing down. And when I looked down, I couldn't believe my eyes. The water was actually coming over Smithy Brow. It was that deep. I looked around at these people. I said, is everybody all right? And they more or less just gazed a bit blankly because everybody was in a state of shock. I said to Margaret, you better ring up for some help. And she went back to her house to ring up, which is only about 200 yards further away.
He said, ring for the authorities or something. And so I said, which ones? And he said, all of them. So that's what I did. I rang and asked for all of them. But after I'd told them that it was Wray, the main street, it went off to the telephone, so with no electric, no telephone, no nothing.
But above Wray, at Baxbottom Farm, Alice and Bill Brown were marooned by the rising river, so swollen now that it covered the valley floor and was demolishing everything in its path. Bill's friend Len had escaped to try and get help.
Of course, it kept getting worse and worse. We didn't know what had happened to Len. Bill thought he'd got drowned, but we had to wait in the house. We were trapped there, so we waited. We got into the end bedroom, furthest away from the flood, and that part was saved. But most of the house was washed away in the staircase, so we were just trapped in that room.
Tell me what the river looked like.
Well, it's just one mass of water, across the valley bottom, because it's quite a narrow valley. It just filled it. It was nearly up to the bedroom. Just a few more feet, we would have been in the water.
When you were in that bedroom looking out, what could you actually see?
We were looking down onto the implement shed below, and the cats were running backwards and forwards, and of course it got higher and higher and just washed it away, and they were all gone. And I didn't cry then, but it was during the night. I thought, I just couldn't sleep, you see, and thinking about all the cats being drowned. Even though we'd had a new calf heifer drowned, and the calf, and all the hens and things like that, and the pig. But it was just the cats, I don't know.
It must have been terrifying.
Well, it was frightening, very frightening. We just stood together just hoping we'd be saved.
What were you thinking?
Well, we just thought it was our time.
Thought your time was up?
Yeah, we thought it was up.
We're still standing on Smithy Brow, and if you look to the left, you can see Anne's house. It's 3 stories high on the riverside, but only 2 stories high on the street side.
And we came in and I heard the greenhouse. We had a greenhouse go, and I heard the glass shatter. And the rain was horrendous. The sprouts that rain causes when it hits the ground, enormous. I had no coat on. Well, yes, I did have a coat on. Nothing on my head. I was thinking, it's hurting my head, this rain.
Anne and her father decided it was no longer safe for her grandmother to stay in the house.
So we took my grandmother up the street and round the corner to some friends, and we left her there. So it would be 20 minutes or so, half an hour before we got her settled and came back. I could hear the sound of the water then. It was really raging. The noise that really sticks in my mind is when I came in to the kitchen and opened the cellar door, I could hear it swirling in the cellar. And I went back out again and I walked a little bit further down, and one of the ladies, she was walking up and she had one shoe in her hand. She said, "My house is gone." And I thought, this is a bit dramatic. I knew she was a bit of an actress, and she taught drama at one of the local schools. And I crossed across and they were gone. There was nothing left. There was nothing there. And then I walked back to this side and I saw another little row of houses that ran the other side of the bridge. I saw the end one crumble into the water.
As I got past about the third or fourth house down, there was an almighty crash, and a sideboard came flying out of the front door. And I kind of looked around. I couldn't believe this because everything was very unreal at this time. What must have happened is that the back of the house must have been knocked off at that precise moment. A wave of water had come surging through the house. The sideboard had been lined up in the hallway. The surge of water had carried it, smashed it straight through the front door. But you can understand that you can hardly believe these things when you see it happening. And anyway, the water's getting deeper and deeper, and I'm knocking on doors trying to find if people are in danger. And as I'm making my way down, I can see at the bottom of the village that some houses have completely gone. And I thought, well, how have they gone? They're just not there. And where are the people that should be in them?
We've been following in Jerry's footsteps, and we're now at the lowest point of the village, and this is where Jerry realised some of the houses had simply disappeared.
But there were still people in the houses that were still standing, and one of them, Ruth Whittam, had heard all this commotion outside.
So I ran upstairs and I thought, well, in case it comes here, I'll pad the back of the door. So I did. And I got blankets and towels and packed the back of the door. Anyway, I thought to myself, well, I'll go and get some more. By the time I got to the kitchen door, the front door broke open. Bang, it went. And I wondered what this bang was. And the bang went, and my vestibule went as well. It was a glass vestibule, and that went. And it was the rush of the water through there, smashed the window, my house window, and all the water came through and then burst through into the kitchen. And it followed me into the kitchen because I flew into the kitchen thinking I can get out of the back door. But the furniture got there before me, and I couldn't prise the back door open. So I jumped across and jumped onto the cooker and the washer, and I jumped onto the windowsill, and I thought I'll try and get through this narrow window. But I couldn't. It was only something like that.
Ruth didn't know how she was going to get out.
It was drawing the floating pressure cooker towards her, which did the trick.
And then the freezer broke loose, and the pressure cooker pan was on the top. So I kept waving the water till the pressure cooker was floating on the top. And I reached out so far and I grabbed it. And I smashed it through the window. And it cut all my thumb round here. But I didn't know about that. And I got hold of the other glass and I worked it out. And then I bowled out. And I bowled out into about that much water. I should think it was 2 foot deep. Without that pressure cooker, I would have drowned.
Did you think you were going to drown?
Yes, I thought there was no escape whatsoever. And then as soon as I smashed the window and got out and tried to shout for everybody, then 3 men from the farm came across and helped to save people. And then Jerry Forrest came down and he rescued the old man out of the little cottage there. I pulled him out of bed, just in his shirt. Poor old Dick Woodhouse, poor old soul.
Jerry had entered the house and fetched Dick out of his bedroom, but while he was in the house, he'd been aware of the force of the water outside.
I couldn't understand why it was so angry, and it was tearing chunks out of everything. When I looked out of Dick Woodhouse's front window, the trees that were going past like juggernauts going down the M6. They were boom, and they weren't going slowly. They were doing probably about 25, 30 miles an hour. And if they hit anything, they were going to take it with them. And these were trees that had been uprooted by the force of water on its way down.
But Jerry didn't just rescue Dick, did he?
No, he rescued Mr. and Mrs. Johnson and their 2 guests, made them walk the plank over the roaring ditch behind.
The house was already being damaged, and they were shouting out of the transom window in the bathroom, a little tiny transom window. What do we do? And I said, smash that window and get out onto, there was like a lean-to that was underneath the bathroom window. And I said, I'll go and get some help, because there's no way I could help them at the moment, because I was, there's a flood raging between us and the house. I went back to the top of the road and I said, I want some people to come down and help me to see if we can get these people out. Well, about half a dozen of the fit fellas came down with me. And unfortunately, they had guests. They had 2 guests that stayed there as well. So there were 4 people now on top of this little outhouse. And to get to them, there was a gap of about 6 or 8 feet between the outhouse I was standing on and their outhouse. So I wanted to make a bridge to get them, in order to get them across. And underneath, the water was ripping away through in a tremendous flood. And I said to these lads, anybody can find me a plank? And miraculously, within minutes, this plank appeared. And it made a perfect bridge, although it was sloping, and it was wet through. And I said, right. And the first lady was hesitant to come across. So I threw the clothesline across, and this lady, big stout lady she was, put it round her waist. And I pulled her across the bridge, more or less. And lo and behold, when she got across, she was that relieved. She just kept walking, rope as well, and off the other end of the roof, and the lads helped him down.
Jerry was later to be recognised for his bravery with 2 police awards.
The next lady across was little Miss Johnson, and she was quite a little frail person. And I was able to go halfway across and put my hand on hers and get her across. And don't forget, this is a very slippery piece of wood that they're walking on. I mean, they didn't realise that if they stayed where they were in dire trouble. And then the other visitor came across, and he was a big burly fella, and he wasn't much trouble getting across. Now the last fella was Mr. Johnson himself, old Mr. Johnson, and he came across in rather a stiff walk, and I got him across. I put my hand out and held him and got him across. He said, I've got two false hips. And I thought, hey, mate, what a fella.
On higher ground, Margaret Staveley was trying to console Anne Beckwith.
Well, I'm not surprised. Anne had just seen her house vanish into the water. There were 3 houses at the bottom, and people who watched the scene say that they simply collapsed in a moment with a kind of puff of smoke.
Yeah, she was standing down on about opposite where Mr. and Mrs. Phillipson lived, the last house on the row. And she was standing, she was saying, my little house, and I was trying to pat her, because she was a lot taller than me, and I was trying to pat her shoulder and say, no, it's all right, Anne, it's there. I just didn't realise it had gone. The houses were there, but not hers, not those 3 that were at the bottom.
At last, Lenny Richardson made it into the village.
Yes, fortunately he wasn't drowned, as Bill Brown had feared.
Lenny made it up the hill, and ran all the way up the hill, into Robindale, back down into the village, to raise the alarm to get help for Bill Brown. And I met him as he came down the village, and he said, you've got to help Bill Brown, he's in a terrible trouble up there. And I thought, well, I can't help Bill Brown. But at that time, people were on the far side of the bridge, which by now was covered in wreckage, was impassable to traffic. But the fire brigade had arrived from Bentham, and they were shouting across, can we help in any way? And I said, well, you can go up to Back's Bottom and see what you can do for Bill Brown. And so I was more or less assured that Bill Brown was getting some attention, but it was a bit late for any other help.
The river went down just as fast as it had risen. At Back's Bottom, the fire brigade arrived.
And it was the fire brigade from Bentham, because they couldn't get from the other side. And they came and managed to get us out of the house by... we put some bedding boxes down to climb down.
The water receded in the village too, but many houses were considered unsafe to enter.
We couldn't come back in here, they wouldn't let us, they didn't know the state of the foundations of the house, whether it would fall down or, what would happen to it. So we went to the pub and they'd got big candles from church, the big altar candles. You could have a bed for an hour at the pub, but every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was water. And I said to my friend, I can't sleep. I don't shut my eyes anymore. And we came out and it was about 4:30 in the morning and the police were cooking bacon. So we had a bacon sandwich with them. And then we came down here and, you can't believe the sight that met you. It was just devastation.
We didn't know what had happened. We didn't know the extent of the damage that had been done. And you was aghast when you came so far down the village and you looked and a quarter of the village had gone. You was just aghast.
It was amazing what an extraordinary number of things were washed away by the river that day.
And some incredibly heavy things too.
We'd a mower that went. We had the raker, the turner. There was a plough in there. There's a stone, it was, I don't know how many tons, that we used to go up the quarry, and the children we used to have to push them up onto it because they couldn't climb up, and then they used to think it was grand, and that had moved. So it was very, very forceful, and I think that the stones and the trees would do those houses in.
One of the oddest things was the fish who'd been washed over the fields by the river and then left stranded.
Well, the fields down below the Mealbank Bridge, they were the worst because they were all covered in silt and fish. There was big ones and small ones, and there was a lot of eels as well. But I couldn't. I think they must have drowned because eels can go on dry land as well as being in the water. Yes, there was loads of eels and fish, but they weren't fit to eat.
Perhaps the worst victims of the flood were Bill and Alice from Baxbottom. They didn't just lose their farm, but their way of life as well. So much went, from their piano right through to their tractor.
Taken even the piano out of the window. I don't know how it managed to get the piano, and it only got that as far as the bottom bridge, about half a mile away, and then it was stuck there for ages with the tractor. The tractor was just bedded in mud, and the van, no trace of it. They couldn't find the van.
Disappeared.
Disappeared. Yeah, we never saw a trace of the van.
Alice had seen the cat swept off the shed roof. They'd lost a cow and a calf, a pig and the hens.
And also one of our dogs. Both of them disappeared, of course. One of them was drowned. The young one happened to be drowned, and the other one went up to Outhwaite, the farm at the top. So Bill was really pleased it was the old one, because you're fond of the old ones, even though the young ones are going to be more good. But
the flood reshaped the bed of the river.
It had taken the back door, and outside the back door was a drop of about 10 foot down to bedrock, down into the river.
Your garden had disappeared.
Everything had gone. Everything in the cellars had gone, except for about 6 foot of stinking, horrible mud. There was no window frames left. It had taken the frames out of the window, not just the glass. The whole frame had gone. All my father's tools, a huge table, a rug that I'd washed that day and left on the floor was still there.
For a year, the victims had to live in caravans.
Yes, I think there was a whole row of caravans parked out on what is now the school playing field.
we lived in a caravan for over a year until they got these houses built. People were very good. I mean, people offered baths and things like that. The neighbours over the wall used to make cakes for us. And we had the church room to do our washing in.
Must have broken your heart.
Well, it was, I don't know, we were glad to be alive, I think. That was the main thing. We survived.
But do you miss the farm?
Well, my husband, terribly. It didn't worry me as much as it worried him, because he couldn't farm full time, you see, he just could keep sheep, and then he had to get part-time work as well.
So the flood had an enormous impact, didn't it?
Oh, yes, yeah. Yes, I got a job as a caretaker at the school.
And you didn't have a job before then?
No, never been out to work in my life, apart from at home and on
You
the
were a
farm.
farmer's wife.
Yeah, and a farmer's daughter as well. I could never farm again properly, you know, just part farming.
That's terrible.
There's no road. It washed the road away, and it was a mile from a hard road. It was only a lane. We lived up. It was very pretty, a lane up to the house. They often called it Little Switzerland. You know, it was a beauty spot in a way. Mm.
The extraordinary thing about the Wray Flood was that despite the level of devastation, there were no casualties.
The fortunate thing about it was it happened at 6 o'clock at night. If this had happened at midnight, it would have been a terrible tragedy, because people would have been in bed and not aware.
Some parts of the village weren't even touched.
When I went home to my own house, the police house, it was bone dry. Everything was pristine, and I felt guilty, you know. There was no water out like that, I couldn't have a bath. But you'd seen all this damage and mayhem, and yet at my end of the village, everything was perfect.
For the people of Wray, it had been a very close shave.
I mean, it was bad enough, but it didn't get any worse. It could have got worse. More water up on the fell, and, it could have washed the village away. If it had got any worse, people would have lost their lives, and I couldn't have helped them.
We're at the memorial to the flood now.
Yes, this was the memorial that Maggie Howarth designed and built, and the people of Wray helped. It was opened in 2000 as a Millennium Project, and I wrote my book about the same time.
But the people who were caught up in the Wray Flood don't need a memorial to remember it by.
We often talk about it, like with Mrs. Staveley. We often reminisce about, do you remember this? And well, I wasn't there, but I was there. And she'll say, well, I wasn't there, but I was over there. You know, and you build up a picture again, and it's still keeps it fresh in your mind. But it's a night I will never, ever forget.
That edition of the feature on the Wray floods was produced and presented by Liz Andrew.